The year 6154 BCE. What a nice time to be a tree. I wonder what it would look like in the year 2025 CE. These trees must be very old. Hold on. Where did all the trees go? The farmers cut them down? No. Ireland. The island of green. Green grass. Green hills. Green and brown barren blanket bog mountains. Green grass. And even green trees. There are trees around the place. Sometimes out in the countryside they are often used as boundary bushes to divide fields, and occasionally you might spot a forest. For an island so green, even amidst the usual deforestation, I would expect to still find a lovely landscape filled with amazing and magical forests full of life. There are some, but they are rare and very small. In total forest coverage, the European average is about 40%, but Ireland's total forest coverage sits at just 11% of its land, one of the continent's lowest. That is still a lot of forest, even if most of it is gone now. The country has many designated forest walks, and to no surprise but lots of enjoyment, they are nice forests. I noticed that a lot of the time alongside the paths lay large grids of spruce trees overlaying their dark forest floors. The more I thought about this, the more I realized that almost every forest that I saw amongst Ireland's fields and mountains are of this type. When I ventured into them, it became clear to me that these forests have not only been planted in dark confined grids, but were planted with Sitka spruce trees for the purpose of harvesting them like a wood crop, as they are a fast-growing tree, specifically imported from North America to fit this purpose across the British Isles. Poor spruce trees. Out of the 11% of forest cover, 9% of Ireland is made up of these tree farms, and just 2% of land contains native trees, or other broadleaf trees, or any other tree not part of a wood crop. Almost none, however, comprises of old-growth forests. At some point, as I learned more about forests, I read that as much as 80% of Ireland was once covered in brilliant expansive woodlands. Even the large blanket bog regions were covered once. I also learned that the total was reduced to less than 1% of forest cover by 1900 CE, which even then was secondary forest. Just about every part of Ireland that once had a tree has been deforested by a human, even all the currently existing native forests. My first thought, after being sad about all the carnage these poor trees faced, was why not figure out what happened to them all, and make a poorly edited YouTube video about the subject. 20,000 years ago, Ireland was covered in ice during the last ice age. Not a tree in sight, just endless fields of grass, ice. Not long later, around 10,000 BCE, temperatures rose, and from what I have read, in an instant all the ice melted, and Ireland became an island. Glaciers left behind some interesting mountains and valleys. The landscape at that time wasn't yet suitable for plant life, as it was understandably too busy warming itself up after being trapped in ice for thousands of years. After Ireland was nice and warm, the first trees began to make their way north and inhabit this vast-ish land. These species were trees like hazel, birch, juniper, willow, and pine trees, I think. As the climate slowly improved, more types of trees came along, and soon, oak trees decided to dominate the entire island. And there it was, a nice island full of beautiful woodlands, covering 80% of Ireland. What did these forests look like? For that, we must go outside. Lots of nice happy trees, ignoring the fact that if you walk a few meters that way, you'll find an anti-deer fence, a gravel path, and a massive field. I think this is a good example, or the best I could find without editing in a PNG on the screen. I like it here. It's also winter without any snow, so it might not give you super mystical vibes today. I'll add a mystical PNG anyway for that. What a nice place. I have an idea. What if humans arrived? I think they would enjoy it here. In 7000 BCE or something, the first human settlers of Ireland, the Mesolithic people, arrived. The Mesolithic people spent their days in the forests, hunting, fishing, and building things, like humans do. These humans ended up cutting many trees down to make houses, fires, and tools, and some small clearances, but it was but a scratch to the forests. I hope they at least asked those trees first. Anyways, thankfully for the trees, they hadn't yet discovered farming, so there was no need to cut them down arbitrarily. Over this time, Ireland's climate also became wetter, which still holds today. This sort of living stuck around for a couple of millennia, but eventually it became clear that there was one thing that they didn't account for: the Neolithic farmers. In about 4000 BCE, Neolithic farmers from the rest of Europe began to arrive in Ireland, bringing their livestock and ways of farming with them. Upon arrival, they found an island covered in forests. Forests? No good, said the Neolithic farmers. How will we introduce cattle to this land without any fields for them to graze on? And so began the deforestation of Ireland. To make way for their cattle, which required a lot of land, the new farmers began to burn forests to the ground en masse, converting them into new fields. They also grew crops like wheat and barley, and for all types of farming, the nutrient-rich soil of these cut-down forests were very sought after by the farmers. When the land used in farming had been drained of its nutrients, farming communities often abandoned their old land towards undisturbed forests, where they cut and burned down even more woodlands to access the nutrients beneath. And when that land became drained, they moved on again to cut down more. In certain areas of the island, the mass clearing of woodland and subsequent abandonment for more bountiful lands took away the protection of tree cover these soils once had, and combined with the wet Irish climate, the land began to leach and become more acidic. This was great news for plants like heather, which rapidly took hold, and over the years, the debris from these plants piled up into a layer of peat. These areas are today known as blanket bogs, big, somewhat barren, dull green and brown landscapes, often with big mountains. These places would have been great with trees. By 500 BCE, so many of the island's woodlands were burned down that Ireland was probably already beginning to look like a big cattle farm. Vast areas of hills, valleys, and lowlands were cleared by burning, and the uplands had been replaced by blanket bog. Even still, there were probably many forests, both ones that regrew as secondary forest on abandoned ground, and in the less accessible regions, but as a whole, Ireland's original and untouched cover of forest was dwindling. By 800 CE, as the population began to see a noticeable increase, it was evident that the level of deforestation would only continue to follow. Over the next few hundreds of years, woodland after woodland would be replaced by expansive sprawling fields of grass, and now only forests that were not in anyone's way at the time remained. By the beginning of the 17th century, Ireland had now come under the rule of the English. In 1600 CE, it is estimated that about 20% of Ireland was still forested, though out of these forests, very little remained as original old growth, with almost all forests being of secondary growth at most, which means forest that was cut down and is in the process of regrowing. Alongside the usual farming needs, a new stage of deforestation was about to be imposed. Beginning in the mid-16th century, during the Tudor conquests, and continuing through the 1600s, the new English rulers began a campaign of Anglicization across their new Irish territories, establishing the plantations. In order to establish control over the population, the English crown confiscated vast amounts of Irish-owned land, and colonized these territories with settlers from Britain. This would inevitably lead to terrible conflict as usual, but I will focus on what it meant for the forests today. It meant just slightly bad things for the forests. These new settlers, like the Irish that previously owned their new properties, quickly got to work developing Ireland's farming into a larger industry, and as I have repeated too many times today, they swept the forests for more land. The settlers were also incentivized to harvest their trees for export more so than prior. English interests had made an entrance, which included a variety of wood requirements. Shipbuilding had become a major industry, and over the next few hundred years, forests across both Britain and Ireland would pay the price. Wood was also needed for barrels in the coopering sector, for which Ireland contributed a moderate amount, and Britain's growing population and dwindling forests made use of Ireland's new exports for general construction, as well as for charcoal to fuel their iron production. There were many usages that wood was sought for, and Ireland also saw their own local usage increase as their population grew fourfold into the 18th and 19th centuries. By 1800, what little forest was left by the 17th century was now very much gone, and now there existed only small pockets of forests, holding out in more obscure places. At the end of the 19th century, from what I have read, Mobile sawmills toured around large amounts of the lessened forests, in a sort of final wave of concentrated deforestation. The Irish population would continue to break off piece after piece of what was left for firewood, and by 1900, less than 1% of the island of Ireland was covered in forest. 6,000 years of deforestation had now left this island barren in trees, and those last 300 years had its speed increased significantly. Blanket bogs seem generally untouched today. Maybe that means some trees can grow up there. These lands, however, are inhabited by sheep, who eat any of the few saplings that attempt to, and can grow in the acidic soils. This problem was not completely unseen, however, mostly because the lack of self-sufficiency in timber was. In 1905, the first attempts at afforestation began at Avondale. Their focus was entirely commercial, but we'll see how they do. They performed some research to figure out how to make the most money, and found that conifer trees outgrow broadleaf trees by a very profitable amount. They also discovered that the Sitka spruce tree species, native to the Pacific Northwest of North America, was especially fast-growing. In 1922, a new Irish government was created, called the Irish Free State, which would later become the Republic of Ireland. Now that the island is divided with the north, are the forest coverage percentages for the national or island coverage? Anyways, the new Irish Free State launched a new well-thought-out afforestation program. To promote self-sufficiency, they excluded agricultural land and focused on the planting of trees on poor-quality marginal land that was unsuitable for dairy production. And in order to maximize profits, these new tree farms were comprised of the Sitka spruce, or otherwise similar spruce species. They would be planted in close and eventually dark grid formations with dikes in between, with the trees being thinned or selectively cut down after about 15 years, and usually the forest would be harvested about 30 or so years after planting. Over the next while, the government implemented some acts and governmenty things, and each year, the total amount of afforested land steadily increased. Timber flowed from the sawmills as usual, and I imagine some pockets deepened a bit too. By 1970, the amount of state-planted tree farms had reached over 500,000 acres, about 2.4% of land. In the 1980s, the government began to issue grants to farmers for planting these forests on their marginal land that they weren't using. This new private sector of afforestation began to rise in the 1990s, and total Irish afforestation peaked in 1995, with 43,000 acres being planted that year. In 1996, the government launched a new strategic plan, in which they aimed to reach a total forest coverage of 17 or 18% by 2030. This goal was set so as to keep increasing their timber production, which meant more spruce tree farms. Unfortunately for them, people got new ideas, like biodiversity and sustainability. State afforestation grants began to be granted less often, as marginal land was partially seen as valuable for planting native forests, which isn't really profitable for farmers, and at the same time, nothing could touch their dairy enterprises, so the land available and desire for planting new tree farms began to decrease, and subsequently, their goals of 18% forest coverage by 2030 were probably redundant. And now we're here, fields of grass, but with some trees now bordering a few farmers' fields, and some squared-off spruce tree plantations dotted about. These forests are probably not the best, but above all, I feel a bit bad for the trees in them. I like all trees, and these ones are grown in grids, with no life other than mushrooms in between them, thinned, and after just 30 years of life, cut down. It makes it a bit better to feel when I am with them that they do have each other, and are much taller than me, and can actually see the sky, unlike me whilst I'm inside. Anyways, tree-hugging talk aside, there were some efforts to plant native broadleaf trees throughout the country. As a result, over the last 100 years, Ireland took on board the ideals of reforestation and increased its native tree cover from its low of 1% to 2%. Well done, problem solved. Now in 2025, the total forest coverage of Ireland is sitting at about 11% of total land. 9% comprises of conifer forests, with that well-earned 2% taking up the rest. These native forests are still almost entirely secondary forests, as over the years, Ireland's old growth and ancient forests really just didn't survive, unfortunately. There are a few examples still existing, but they are few and far between, and extremely small. Going a bit further back, in 1989, a new dedicated forestry management company was founded, called Coilta, or Quilcha. I will say Coilta and hope it isn't very wrong. Anyways, back to the modern day. This is the company that handles everything to handle with the country's state-owned forests. If you have been to any forest walks in the country today, you might have seen this name on one of the signs or information boards, or the signs warning you not to eat the berries they spray with herbicides. Sometimes in the middle of nowhere too, on signs asking you not to climb on their timber stacks, because this company's primary focus is to commercially manage the state's forestry assets. Biodiversity and talk about native species seem to be taking lead today, and Coilta likes to talk about it all too. They do some things well. Looking at their website though, a lot of it is highlighting how great their timber products are, and how profitable and sustainable Irish wood is. I know wood is very useful, and in terms of numbers they at least plant new trees in place of those they felled, but sometimes it hurts to see their big clearances of moulding tree stumps. The company owns about 7% of Ireland's land, and I think they say they allocate about 20% of that, so about 1.4% of land, for biodiversity, which are kind of the numbers we saw at the beginning of the 20th century. They seem to handle this with as much care for the trees themselves as their wood crops, but I do appreciate that they are at least doing something for forests, even if it might be for money in the end. Thank you, Coilta employees anyway. Many of you do very good work. Nowadays, there are also quite a few rewilding projects around the country, run by a wide range of rewilding experts. Many are people with thousands of qualifications I don't understand, but sound very impressive. Some are YouTubers, and others are people who just independently like trees. I like seeing all of these projects around. I am not that much of an expert on rewilding, but there is a lot of Miyawaki and biodiverse ecosystems being spoken, so they all seem to know what they are talking about. Many of these projects are quite small, often comprising of a corner of someone's back garden, which maybe isn't the scale of rewilding that would make drastic changes, but I am all for planting any new forests, no matter how small. Well, maybe at least 2 trees. I think that covers what is happening with trees today. Some publicity projects, some small but nice rewilding efforts, and some focus on wildlife, which is very nice. But mostly it looks like the old-fashioned timber industry remains ordinary. Now I will finish without providing any alternate solutions, because whilst I think of an actual suggestion, all I could really say is, be nicer to trees. There we go, problem solved. That is what I have for today. Goodbye.